The man riding north along that Montana ridge on the afternoon of June 25, 1876, had never lost a battle, not once. Not at Gettysburg, where he charged Confederate cavalry at full gallop and lived. Not at the Washita, where he hit a sleeping village at dawn and rode away with prisoners and headlines. Not in any of the skirmishes and ambushes and frontier encounters that had filled the years between the Civil War and this afternoon. George Armstrong Custer had built his entire identity on a single proposition. That audacity wins. That the man willing to ride fastest and hit hardest walks away from fights that kill cautious men. That luck favors the bold, and God protects the reckless, and history remembers the chargers, not the planners. That proposition had been confirmed so many times across so many battlefields that by the summer of 1876, it had hardened from a belief into a fact. And facts, unlike beliefs, do not bend when reality changes. In approximately 90 minutes, Custer and every man riding with him would be dead. 210 soldiers, not one survivor, not one witness to explain what happened or what he said or what he was thinking when the world he understood stopped making sense. The last verified trace of his command would not be a heroic speech or a defiant order. It would be a scribbled note on a scrap of paper, misspelled and urgent, begging a subordinate to bring ammunition, bring packs. Those two misspelled words are the last sound George Armstrong Custer ever made that reached the outside world. Everything after them is silence and bones. 3 weeks before Custer rode north, something happened on Rosebud Creek that no military dispatch could have captured, and no Washington official would have taken seriously if it had. Sitting Bull, the Hunkpapa Lakota holy man, whose authority rested not on military rank, but on spiritual power, performed the sun dance, the most sacred ceremony in Lakota spiritual life. He sliced 50 pieces of flesh from each arm. He danced for hours, staring into the sun, until the sky went white and his legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the ground in a trance so deep that the men around him thought he might be dead. When he woke, he described what he had seen. Soldiers falling upside down into the camp, tumbling from the sky like grasshoppers, their hats blowing off as they fell, pouring down in a cascade of blue and dust into the lodges of his people. The vision was specific, it was vivid, and it was understood by every person who heard it as a promise from the powers that governed the world. A great victory was coming, the soldiers would come, and they would fall. The vision electrified the gathering. Warriors who heard it did not hear a prophecy, they heard a guarantee. The powers that moved the sun and grew the grass and sent the buffalo had spoken through their holiest man. Soldiers would fall into the camp. Not might fall, would fall. The certainty that spread through the encampment after Sitting Bull's vision was not the certainty of hope, it was the certainty of physics. Rain falls, rivers flow, soldiers fall. The effect on the gathering was immediate. Bands that had been considering scattering for the summer instead consolidated. Families that might have drifted toward the agencies stayed. The encampment along the Little Bighorn River, the place the Lakota called greasy grass for the thick vegetation on its banks, swelled to a size that no living person had ever seen. Between 7,000 and 10,000 people, Hunkpapa at the southern end, Oglala further north, Cheyenne beyond them, Arapaho, Sans Arc, Miniconjou. The lodges stretched along the river for nearly 3 miles. From the bluffs above, the encampment would have looked less like a camp and more like a city that had assembled itself in the path of a man who believed that cities scatter when you charge them. This one would not scatter. It was waiting. Every decision Custer made on June 25 grew from a single root assumption that had been fed by years of experience and watered by a career of success. The assumption was simple. When the army appears, the village runs. It had always been true. At the Washita in 1868, Black Kettle's village had not run because it was attacked at dawn while sleeping, and Custer had learned from that success that speed and surprise were the keys to pinning a mobile enemy. Every engagement since had confirmed the pattern. Warriors fought briefly, then the families fled, scattering across the plains in every direction, and the army's problem was not defeating the enemy, but catching them before they dissolved into the landscape like smoke into wind. Custer was not riding toward the little Bighorn worried about losing a fight. He was riding worried about losing the opportunity. If the village spotted him too early, it would break apart. Thousands of people would stream away through coulées and ravines and river crossings that the cavalry could not cover with 600 men. He would arrive at an empty campsite full of abandoned teepees and cold fire rings, and the frustration of having come so close to the career-defining victory he needed and watching it evaporate in the June heat. That fear, the fear of arriving too late, drove every calculation. His Crow and Arikara scouts saw something different. From a high point called the Crow's Nest, they had spotted the massive pony herd in the valley below. Thousands of horses, a dark, shifting mass against the green bottomland that stretched further than any scout had ever seen. Mitch Boyer, a mixed-blood interpreter who knew this country and its people, looked at the signs and told Custer plainly, "Too many. If they rode into that valley, they would not come out alive." Bloody Knife, one of Custer's most trusted Arikara scouts, made the calculation physical. He gestured toward the valley and made a prediction that needed no translation. More warriors down there than the soldiers had bullets. Custer squinted through the haze. He could not see the pony herd clearly. Whether he genuinely could not see it, or whether his mind had already decided what existed in that valley and was filtering out everything that contradicted the decision, is a question that 148 years has not resolved. There is a blindness that afflicts men who have been right so many times that being wrong becomes impossible to imagine. You stop being a man who makes good decisions. You become a man who cannot lose. And when scouts point at a valley and say there are more warriors down there than you have bullets, you do not hear a warning. You hear a challenge. He saw opportunity, not danger. What he said next has been preserved with moderate credibility through scout reports. Custer's luck, the biggest Indian village on the continent. He saw opportunity, not danger. He saw the victory that would save his career, restore his reputation, and send him back east with a story that would fill newspaper front pages from New York to San Francisco. Then a sergeant reported that troopers had been spotted by native riders on the trail. The element of surprise was gone, or so Custer believed. The village would scatter. He must attack now. This moment, the instant Custer decided to charge rather than wait for reinforcements, is the hinge on which 268 lives turned. He was applying the lesson of every battle he had ever fought to the one battle where that lesson was lethally wrong. The morning of June 25th. The 7th Cavalry had ridden through the night, men hollow-eyed with fatigue in saddles they had occupied for 18 hours, horses stumbling over terrain they could barely see, and Custer, operating on an internal energy that had sustained him through 4 years of civil war and a decade of frontier campaigns, made the decision that military historians have been dissecting ever since. He divided his command. Captain Frederick Benteen received 3 companies, roughly 125 men. Orders: scout the bluffs to the left, make sure no warriors or families escape through the southern valleys. Benteen, a veteran officer who had despised Custer for years and considered most of his tactical decisions reckless, accepted the orders with the controlled contempt of a professional who knew he was being sent on a wild goose chase. Major Marcus Reno received 3 companies, roughly 140 men. Orders: cross the Little Bighorn and charge the southern end of the village directly. Pin the warriors in place. Custer kept 5 companies, approximately 210 men. He would ride north along the ridge above the eastern bank, hidden from the village by the terrain. and strike from the flank or rear once Reno's attack fixed the enemy's attention south. The remaining company guarded the pack train carrying reserve ammunition. The ammunition was loaded on mules that moved at the speed of tired mules on broken ground, which is to say, roughly 1/3 the speed of cavalry on horseback. By the time Custer divided his command, the pack train was already several miles behind. The ammunition gap was not an abstraction. Each soldier carried 100 rounds in his belt and saddlebags, 100 rounds fired through a single-shot Springfield carbine that jammed every third or fourth shot in sustained combat. Do the math. In a serious engagement, 100 rounds lasts perhaps 30 minutes. After that, a soldier with a jammed Springfield is holding an expensive club. And the mules carrying the next 100 rounds were somewhere behind him on a trail he could no longer see. This was the equation Custer was working with when he divided 600 men into groups that could not communicate and sent them against a force whose size he had not verified. He had no signal system, no reserve, no fallback position, no way to tell Reno the village was 5 times larger than expected, no way to recall the pack train. He was commanding 3 separate forces by handwritten notes, carried on horseback across miles of terrain where a messenger might take 30 minutes to cover ground that a shout could cross in seconds. Every minute of delay between columns was a minute the enemy could use to concentrate against whichever column was weakest, and the enemy was not going to scatter. Around 3 in the afternoon, Reno's 140 men splashed across the Little Bighorn and formed a line. They charged south toward the village at a gallop, giddons snapping, dust rising behind them in a brown wall that rolled ahead of the horses. For a few hundred yards, it looked like every other cavalry charge in the history of the American frontier. Then the village answered, not with the panicked scattering Custer had predicted. With fury, warriors poured from the lodges in numbers Reno's men had never imagined. On foot, on horseback, flowing around the flanks of the skirmish line like a river flooding around a rock. The volume of fire was unlike anything these soldiers had experienced. Winchesters and Henrys cracking from every direction in a sustained roar that made the Springfields sound like individual handclaps in a thunderstorm. For every round a soldier sent down range, 5 came back. The air itself seemed to be made of lead and noise. Reno halted the charge, dismounted, tried to form a skirmish line in a stand of timber near the river. Horses screamed and fell sideways, throwing riders into the tall grass. Men fired single-shot Springfields as fast as they could extract and reload, while repeating rifles answered 5 rounds for every one. Bloody Knife stood near Reno, the Araucarian scout who had warned Custer there were more warriors than bullets. The man who had been right about everything. A bullet hit him in the head. His blood and brain matter sprayed across Reno's face and chest. Reno froze, his hand locked on his reins. His face masked in another man's blood. His eyes went somewhere that was not this battlefield, somewhere interior and unreachable, the place a mind goes when what it is seeing exceeds its capacity to process. When he came back, seconds or minutes later, nobody could say which, he ordered retreat. The word did not reach every man. The retreat became a rout. Troopers scrambled for horses. Some mounted and galloped for the river, while warriors rode alongside them at arm's length, firing into the mass. The Little Bighorn crossing became a killing ground. Men drowned in chest-deep water, dragged down by the weight of wet cartridge belts. Others were cut down clawing up the bluffs on the far side, exposed and helpless. In less than 30 minutes, Reno lost roughly 40 killed and 13 wounded. His command was shattered, and the critical fact that would seal Custer's fate was this: Custer could not see any of it. He was on the ridge above, separated by terrain and distance and the sound of his own column's movement. He had no idea that the southern jaw of his attack had just been broken off. From the ridgeline, Custer caught glimpses of the village below. the true scale of it becoming visible for the first time. Some accounts say his men cheered. Others say a different sound passed through the column. Not a cheer, a recognition. The kind of quiet that settles over men when the math they have been ignoring suddenly becomes impossible to avoid. Custer acted. He needed Benteen. He needed the pack train. He needed ammunition. He sent his orderly, Giovanni Martini, a young Italian immigrant who had been born Giovanni Crostino Martino and who barely spoke English, riding south with a verbal message. But Custer's adjutant, Lieutenant William Cook, a tall Canadian with mutton chop whiskers so enormous they had become his identifying feature on every battlefield he had ever crossed, grabbed a scrap of paper. The urgency was too great for spoken words that might be garbled by a man who barely spoke the language. Cook pulled a pencil from his jacket and pressed the paper against something flat, his knee, his saddle, the stock of his carbine, and wrote 10 words that would become the most analyzed sentence in American military history. Benteen. Come on, big village, be quick, bring packs. The misspelling, packs instead of packs. That single error tells you more about the moment than any heroic quote ever attributed to Custer. It tells you about a pencil moving across paper so fast that the hand holding it does not have time to add letters that spelling requires. It tells you about a mind operating under pressure so intense that the difference between packs and packs is a luxury the moment cannot afford. And it tells you about a man, Cook, who would be dead within the hour, found lying beside his commander on a Montana hillside, his magnificent whiskers the detail that allowed identification when his face could not. This scrap of paper is the last verified communication from Custer's command. It survived because Martini tucked it into his glove and rode south, and Benteen kept it. Everything after this note is silence. What the note reveals is precise and devastating. Custer knows the village is enormous. He knows he needs bullets. He knows he needs Benteen's 125 men. The tone is urgent but not panicked. He still expects to fight and win. He still expects support to arrive. He is wrong on both counts. Martini kicked his horse south. The animal was tired. Every horse in the column was tired. They had been riding since the previous night with minimal water and no rest. But the urgency in Cook's voice when he pressed the note into Martini's hand was enough to make a tired horse run. As Martini crested a hill heading south, he looked back. This is the last image any living person would ever have of Custer's command. A column of cavalry on a ridgeline in the afternoon light. Horses in a line. Guidons against the sky. Dust hanging in the air, golden and heavy, the kind that catches the late sun and preserves everything in amber. He could hear gunfire behind him, distant and muffled, but the column was still in order, still riding, still alive. He turned south and rode toward Benteen. Behind him, the world closed like a door that would never reopen. The dust settled. The column moved on. And whatever George Armstrong Custer thought or said or feared or hoped in the minutes that followed went into the ground with him and has stayed there ever since. Everything we know about the next 60 to 90 minutes comes from 3 sources. The positions of the dead, found 2 days later by Terry's relief column, battlefield archaeology conducted over the following century, spent cartridge casings and arrowheads and buttons and fragments of bone mapped with the precision of a crime scene investigation performed 100 years too late. And native oral histories, collected over decades from warriors who were there, but whose testimony was dismissed for a century because the men asking the questions did not want to hear the answers. No 2 accounts agree on every detail. What follows is the most widely accepted reconstruction. Custer's 5 companies descended from the ridge toward Medicine Tail Coulee, a broad ravine sloping down to a ford on the Little Bighorn. He may have intended to cross and strike the northern end of the village, catching the warriors between his force and Reno's attack from the south. If so, it was bold. perfectly consistent with the man who had never lost. At the ford, warriors appeared on the far bank, Cheyenne and Minneconjou Lakota. They opened fire from behind cut banks and brush. The crossing was contested, the column stalled, and then turned, north and uphill, away from the village, climbing toward higher ground above the river. This retreat from the ford, whether ordered or forced, was the beginning of the end. Crazy Horse was already moving. The Oglala war leader swept a massive force through the ravines north and east of the ridge. He did not charge into the soldiers' guns. He went around them, using terrain the soldiers did not know existed to position warriors behind the ridge, cutting off the retreat routes Custer's men would need when they realized the fight was lost. By the time the soldiers understood they were surrounded, the circle was already closed. This was not a mob attack. This was a coordinated envelopment executed across miles of terrain by a commander who communicated through messengers and shared instinct rather than written orders. The result was as precise as anything taught at West Point. More precise because the man executing it did not need a textbook to understand ground he had hunted since childhood. By 4 in the afternoon, 210 men were on a ridge, with enemies closing from every direction and no way out. Company L, under Lieutenant James Calhoun, Custer's brother-in-law, formed a skirmish line on what is now called Calhoun Hill. The cartridge casings found there a century later told a story of discipline. Organized volley fire, brass in neat rows. These men fought in order. They held their formation, and they were overwhelmed by a force that flowed around them like water around a stone. Company C under Captain Tom Custer was found further north. The casings here were scattered, erratic, the patterns of men firing while moving, fighting retreat under pressure that was increasing by the minute. Then the line broke. Warriors surged through the gaps between companies. What had been an organized defense became isolated clusters of men fighting back-to-back with single-shot carbines against repeating rifles that outgunned them round for round. On Last Stand Hill, the highest point on the ridge, approximately 40 bodies were found clustered together. Dead cavalry horses arranged in a rough circle, shot by their own riders to serve as barricades. The grass trampled into a paste of mud and blood. Dozens of Springfield casings around each body showing men who had fought until their ammunition ran out and their weapons jammed and their hands bled from prying stuck cartridges from overheated chambers with pocket knives that snapped under the pressure. The copper casings had expanded in the heat and welded themselves to the chamber walls. A soldier with a jammed Springfield in the middle of that fight had 2 options: dig at the stuck round with a knife while repeating rifles cracked from 30 yards, or draw his Colt and fire 6 rounds and then hold an empty weapon and wait for whatever came next. The men on Last Stand Hill chose both options, and neither saved them. Some warriors described a final desperate charge by a small group of soldiers, a breakout attempt or a last act of defiance. It was cut down within minutes. Others described soldiers at the very end turning their revolvers on themselves. The sound of single pistol shots from inside the perimeter, spaced seconds apart, each one meaning the same thing. The fight on Last Stand Hill may have lasted less than 30 minutes. Some archaeologists argue 20. In less time than it takes to eat a meal, a command ceased to exist. Giovanni Martini lived to be 73. He died in Brooklyn, New York in 1922, a long way from the Montana Ridge where he had last seen George Armstrong Custer alive. He had changed his name to John Martin. He had married an American woman. He had raised children who spoke English as their first language in a borough where the loudest sounds were streetcars and vendors and the clatter of a city that had nothing to do with the silence of a Montana valley. But he never stopped hearing the sound, gunfire fading behind him as he rode south, distant, muffled by terrain and wind, growing fainter with every stride of his horse until it was less a sound than a feeling, a vibration in his chest that would never fully stop. He told anyone who asked that when he rode away, the command was still in good order, still riding, still alive. He said this for 46 years. He said it in a language he had learned to speak fluently in the decades since that afternoon. And every time he said it, he was really saying something else. I did not know they were dying. I thought I was carrying a message that would save them. By the time he found Benteen, Benteen had already found Reno's shattered command on a hilltop. The note was delivered. Benteen read it. Be quick. Bring packs. Benteen did not hurry. He made the judgment that saving Reno's survivors was more urgent than riding into unknown terrain toward a commander who might already be beyond saving. Whether that judgment was correct or cowardly has been argued for 148 years with no resolution in sight. What is beyond argument is the result. The packs never arrived. The reinforcements never came. And 210 men died in the gap between a misspelled word and the silence that followed it. Lieutenant James Bradley led the scouts that reached the battlefield 2 days later. He wrote in his journal with the plainness of a man trying not to let what he was seeing overwhelm his ability to hold a pen. I counted 197 bodies. He described men who appeared to have fought in tight, desperate clusters, shoulder to shoulder, and others scattered alone in ravines far from the main field, as though they had broken and run and died in isolation, with no one left to help them. The geography of death told the story of a command that had disintegrated, men who lost cohesion, lost their officers, lost hope, and died where they fell. Within weeks, the news reached the East Coast. Headlines screamed massacre, and the note that begged for bullets became the permission slip for everything that followed. Crazy Horse bayoneted in custody, Sitting Bull shot by his own people's police, the buffalo exterminated, the children taken, and at Wounded Knee in 1890, Custer's own regiment killed over 200 unarmed Lakota, 20 medals of honor awarded for the massacre. The note said, "Bring packs." America brought something worse. It brought the full weight of an empire down on the people whose warriors had proved that the empire could bleed. The great victory at the Little Bighorn became the instrument of the people's destruction. The battle was weaponized against the people who won it. Hollywood completed what politics began. Errol Flynn played Custer as a noble, golden-haired hero in 1941. The Last Stand became an icon of doomed courage, painted and repainted, with Custer always at the center, saber raised, hair flowing. Almost none of it was true. He had cut his hair short. The sabers were left at the supply depot. The so-called stand lasted less than 30 minutes, and the men around him were not striking poses. They were crouched behind dead horses, jamming cartridges into overheated carbines with shaking hands while the world collapsed around them. We opened with a man who had never lost riding toward something he could not see the end of. Now you know what he could not see. A vision fulfilled, a village that would not run, a note that arrived too late, and the silence of 210 men whose bones told the only story that survived them. Benteen, come on, big village, be quick, bring packs. The packs never arrived. And the last sound connected to Custer's command is not a battle cry. It is 10 words on a scrap of paper written by a man whose pencil moved too fast for spelling. Behind those words, fading like gunfire heard from a ridge you are riding away from, the silence of 210 men still waiting in the Montana dirt.